My name is James Page. I spent about 12 years in the classroom teaching mainly eighth grade. I did some split seventh, eighth a couple of years. And then I was recruited out of the classroom to come work out here. I work for Texas A&M Natural Resource Institute, but I'm housed here at Long Acres Ranch, and so I do the bidding of the ranch. It's kind of a unique relationship with between A&M and the ranch as well. So they're able to share in joint resources because of that. We all take turn, or we all lead certain areas of programming and then assist each other. But one of the programs that I lead is our eighth grade program. And so we work very closely, as you mentioned, with Lamar Consolidated. And our goal in the relationship that we have with the local school district is to reach the kids every few years. And so, in relationship to the quail, we actually have a first grade program where we provide all the materials and the kids actually hatch out quail in the classroom. And then we get all our materials back and clean it up, set it up, and we raise the quail in our brooder boxes, and then we turn them loose on the property. This place used to be many years ago covered up in northern bobwhite, but between farming and ranching that took place out here, a lot of the habitat was destroyed, and so the quail population drastically decreased. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. So we're in the process of doing a little bit of restoration on site and getting our quail population back ever so slightly. Then the kids come back out again in fifth grade, and they get to do the quail CSI that Scott had talked about. So we have a bunch of dummy nests set up. We actually use actual quail eggs, but we have dummy nests set up, and the kids learn more about the quail and predation. And they have to use reasoning to decide what predator predated the nest. And then the eighth graders come back out, and then we do like a full quail biology. We look at the external morphology, and then we also do a quail necropsy. And then finally, we play a game where the kids act like quail to the point we just keep throwing all these different aspects at them that they're like, we're done. And we say, that's the life of a quail. It's very difficult for quail. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the northern bobwhite, and so we're going to focus on the biology of the northern bobwhite. But just to mention briefly, there are 4 quail species found in the state of Texas. So you got your northern bobwhite, which actually make up a majority of the state in terms of their range. They're kind of somewhat West Texas all the way across through the east in terms of just the state. Then you have your blue-scaled quail, your Montezuma, and your Gamble, all of which are mostly found on the western side of the state, and a much smaller populations in terms of your northern bobwhite in the state of Texas. To know the bird is to know the bird, and I know that's very cliche, but there's a lot of things that we know about the bird, and there's things we don't know about the bird. But we do know and recognize is that there is a decline in quail populations. And so, kind of recap in terms of the quail, bobwhites are named based off the sound that they make. And of course, they make many other sounds as well, but their general bobwhite sound is how they get their name. They're also referred to as indicator species, the canary of the prairie. When you have quail and all of a sudden the quail disappear, you got a problem. And that problem starts with the quail effect, but then it domino effect into many other species. And so we'll brief on that later on. They have a home range of about 40 acres, but depending on the weather, depending on the habitat, they can range from 10 to 80 acres. So if you think about South Texas, West Texas, they may have to travel a little bit farther to find food and water. And so their home range is going to adjust based on the difference in the habitat. They can spend up to 3/4 of their time within roughly 22 acres. And so obviously they have to have food, and that cover is very important. Sometimes we find them up to about 25% of their time spent in the woods, typically along the edges. But again, that all relates back to the type of habitat that is available to them and what's going on with that habitat. Dr. Rollins likes to refer to everything in terms of you need a softball field. You need cover where you have home plate, where you have first base, second base, third base, pitcher's mound. You need cover about that distance. If the cover's too far apart, you're not going to have quality habitat for quail. If it's too close, it's the same as well. General carrying capacity is about 3 birds per acre. That's when the conditions are right. If conditions are great, you may look at about 4 birds. Unfortunately, when we have quail, we're typically seeing about 1 bird per acre. And life expectancy is typically less than a year. Reason being is up to 80% of the population dies off every single year. And we'll dive into that here in a few moments as well. But that's rough on a species if you're losing 80% of your population every year. It is known to have birds that have been studied and observed that can live up to about 5 years. But that is one smart bird or a very lucky bird. But about 5 years is the max that they're going to survive out in the wild. So I want to pause right here and not do all the talking. At your table, I want you to observe your bird. You're welcome to touch it, pick it up, handle it. And I would encourage you to look at it and measure the bird. Measure the height, measure the wingspan, get a mass of that bird, get to know your bird just a little bit, and then we'll dive into some more details. Yep, if you hook right behind the head, there you go. All right, so as you are finishing up, may continue to look at the bird and handle it. These birds, just so you know, were pen raised. We obviously have to, in order to be able to provide birds for kids to do necropsies, and we go out to a supplier and purchase them from him. When you look at these birds, typically you're going to find the height to be anywhere between 9 and 11 inches. Your wingspan is generally going to be between 13 and 15 inches. And this is, again, regard to this specific species of northern bobwhite. And then their weight is going to be generally around 160 to 180. Okay, so now what I'm mentioning are averages in terms of numbers. And so if you got a pen-raised bird that's living a great life, being provided everything that they need and no threat, they may have a tendency to gain a little bit more weight. If they're having to jockey for position because the pen is crowded, then they may not have as much weight, so on and so forth. So those are our average numbers. But I want to kind of dive into a little bit more and look at the bird more closely. So when we look at the head of the bird, what we're able to do is, first off, determine is it predator or prey. The saying, eyes on the front hunt, eyes on the side hide. But when you look at this bird, is it a predator or is it a prey? It's a prey, right? On surface value, it is indeed a prey. Everything wants to eat this bird, including humans. The thing about it is, though, that's a catch-22 because these birds are also predators. When they're young, they're eating a lot of insects. So at that point, they are the predator. But as a whole, they are referred to as the prey. Male versus female. So these birds are sexual dimorphic. When you're looking for these birds, a male is going to have that white patch on the front. The females are going to be more of that brown, drabby color. Who has a male? I'll say I think I only have male white patch. Yeah. So we have 2 males, and then therefore our other 3 are females. And then when we look at their beak helps us obviously to determine kind of what their food source is if we're not able to observe them eating. So they had that short, slightly curved beak or small curved beak. And so I always ask the kids, how many teeth do they have? Some of the kids that we have come out here only live in the city. They only play video games. And so they may not always recognize the birds don't have teeth. But they have something equivalent to molars. Does anybody know what that is?
The beak?
No, not the beak. Their gizzard. So their gizzard acts as the molars in compared to humans. Something else that's interesting that kids find completely fascinating is that these birds will pick up rocks, tiny little pebbles, and they will then store them in their gizzard, and it acts as molars, grinding back and forth, crushing those hard seed products that they consume. They do spend a lot of time eating seeds, as we mentioned, but when they're younger, they also eat insects as well as fruit. I actually walked up on a northern bobwhite one time, and he was like chest buried into a cactus fruit. The fruit had been on the ground for a while. It had become a little bit fermented, so he was chowing down. He heard me walk up on him, and I was very close. He backed out of that fruit, and he looked up, and he was like, I guess you're not going to eat me, and then stuck his head right back in. I was like, that's why y'all don't survive very long. But he was living high on the hog. They do eat vegetation from time to time, forbs of various nature, but a lot of times it has to depend on weather conditions and the availability of food. When we look at the wings, they're short and round. Does that mean these birds are going to be flying long distances? Absolutely not. These birds are non-migratory. Wherever they're at, that's pretty much where they're going to stay. They're short and round, as I mentioned. When they get spooked, they will flush. They'll fly roughly about 40 yards, and they hit the ground, and they're running again. And so the really cool thing is when you look at the meat, we're not going to do a necropsy today, but if we were to go inside, we would see that they are completely dark meat throughout. When you go and order chicken, you can get light meat and dark meat, right? Well, these birds, because they do flying and running, all their meat is dark. The reason it's dark is because of a protein referred to as myoglobin. And that myoglobin, along with the increased use of oxygen, results in that dark meat. They do obviously have flight feathers because they do spend a little bit of time flying. Again, most of the time they spend their entire life on the ground. They nest on the ground. They eat on the ground. Sometimes you'll see them perched up in lower branches and stuff to kind of get a view from higher up. The coolest thing about the quail is if you lay down on the ground, the eye closest to the ground is the height of a chick, and the eye farther from the ground is the height of a quail. And so a lot of times we go out in the field and we lay down and we look and we see, can a bird run through there? Is our habitat good enough or not? And then, of course, they have all of the different types of feathers pertaining to flight. What's really interesting is this tiny little feather right here. A lot of birds have that. That's the alula. That feather alone acts as the rudder. And so they're able to adjust that feather in flight to create those crazy angles that they make when they're flushing. To age a bobwhite, we look at the feathers themselves. So we're looking for a buffy tip. And so you can look at your bird real quick. Basically, you're looking at those primary coverts. Is there a buffy tip? Is it white? Kind of almost like a little paintbrush of a white or kind of a tan dot located there. If not, if there's not, then it is an adult. If it has a buffy tip, then it is a juvenile. Now, what's really cool about these birds is because they have such a short lifespan, they reach adulthood at roughly about 15 weeks. And so about that time, that's when they transition. You really start to see that full coloration coming out, both in the males and the females. Their feathers, like most birds with feathers, they're used for camouflage. And when you look at these birds, they're very cryptic. Again, they're living on the ground. They're close to the earth. So they're going to be more of that brown, drabby color. But you also think about the fact that that's where a lot of more of your dead leaf foliage is going to be found. And so again, they want to be cryptic as much as possible. And then we've already discussed the flight aspect. So the feathers are designed to make them more streamlined. And then also that thermoregulation. You think about these birds, especially the males, they don't have a scrotum like mammals do. And the point of a scrotum is to regulate the temperature. If it gets too hot, too cold, the sperm dies. And so within the males, their testes is actually located at the lower portion of their body, back here in the back. And so the reason being is they can adjust their feathers to allow more airflow or less airflow to help regulate temperature. And so they're able to do that with all of their feathers throughout the year. And then their feet. Their feet look a lot like chicken feet. Okay, they do a lot of scratching on the ground because that's where they live. So they got 3 toes to the front, 1 kicked out to the back. They are referred to as ressorial, just like chickens, because they spend all their time running and scratching the ground, looking for seeds and things of that nature. I'd encourage you to look for the uropygial gland. So it's right above the tail feathers. And so it has that little nipple-like structure on there. And in fact, if you were to squeeze on that, you probably would be able to excrete a little bit of oil. So these birds do preen, not near as much as ducks. So the phrase "water off a duck's back." Why does the water slide off? Is because of that uropygial gland that birds use. So they preen, and basically they're spreading that oil through the feathers, or they're straightening their feathers if they ran through some brush and it kind of got damaged. And so think about these birds in terms of living outdoors. If they get sopping wet, can they fly very well? If they have to flush, absolutely not. So they try to keep their feathers waterproof as much as possible. When we dive into the reproduction of these birds, we try to know them better. Not only with habitat do we have to think about food and water, but we also have to think about structure in terms of ability for nest sites to be located. So we have to have adequate ground cover. You need somewhat dense native grasses and forbs with scattered shrub and brush. So it goes back to thinking about a softball field. Having larger structures spread out, and then smaller grasses, but with dense native grasses spread between. Their breeding season is typically June to August, but it can range anywhere between May and September, depending on what's going on with the weather and primarily food availability. If there's too much of a drought, they're going to have a rough year reproducing. If it's too wet, they're going to have a rough year reproducing as well. Their clutch size can range between 10 to 16, typically around 12 or 13 eggs is what you're going to find. Incubation takes about 23 days. Like most birds, they're going to lay all their eggs. They're going to then sit on those eggs so they all hatch at the same time. What they've found is that, especially with quail, is that as the time is getting close to start hatching, the chicks will start peeping to one another. And so once everybody's on board, then they all emerge at the same time. The reason being is so they can immediately leave that nest and get away, because that is when the greatest amount of predation is happening for these birds, is in the nest site, whether it's for the eggs themselves or for the adults. Males and females will incubate. They'll both take turns sitting on the nest, and the female tends to brood her chicks for about 4 weeks. But at 2 weeks of age, those chicks are able to fly. They can't travel those 40 yards quite yet, but they are able to flush, jump up, fly around, hide, and then when the threat has left, then they all start peeping to group back up again. There is a variety of mating strategies that these birds use. We think about like ducks, they're monogamous for a year. Geese and swans are monogamous for life. These birds, they're with the eighth graders, I joke around, I say these birds are players because that's literally what they do. But we go back to 80% of the population dies every year. So why are they players? Because they have to be. That is their lifestyle. They have to have as many babies as possible to keep that species going. So there are a variety of mating strategies that they utilize. Getting more into the quail decline, like what's going on? Why is it happening? When we think about Free Bird by Leonard Skinner, he refers to in this bird you cannot change. And so he's referencing himself and other things. But we can't change the quail. We can't get out there and force him to eat things or live in the trees or anything like that. So we cannot manipulate the bird, but what we can manipulate is the habitat of which we find these birds. Now, the sad part is roughly 80% of the northern bobwhite quail have declined in the last 30 years. When we start looking at other aspects, we find that roughly 90% of our grasslands in the southeast and eastern North America has been lost over time. Is there a correlation? Probably. The problem is we don't know exactly why 80% of the birds have declined in the last 30 years. So in other words, there's no clear-cut answer, but there are some theories, and there's some working theories. And so when we think about, a lot of it has to do with habitat loss, right? We think about the amount of farming that is needed, the amount of urban sprawl that is taking place across our prairies. We think about ranching that's taking effect, and there's some transition. Okay, so we're slowly through education and stuff. We're working with farmers, we're working with ranchers to start transitioning into how can we coexist with our ultimate food product, but also wildlife. So there's regenerative farming, rotating crops, rotating your animals through pastures and things like that. And there's also that chemical use, pesticide, herbicide. The old way was, well, if I double the dose, then it'll have twice as much effect. We know for a fact that that's not the case. It just produces more runoff. when that happens. Mentioned earlier the drought and flooding. And so when we have a really, really good year, birds are going to do great. Case in point, I love picking dewberries. I love making jelly. I love eating cobbler. When we have rains fall at the right time, the berries are ginormous and plentiful. If we don't get the rains when we need to, it's slim pickings. And so everything is affected by the weather. Small mammals. Why would small mammals play a major role in this?
Destroy habitat.
Cats, they could be destroying habitat. Ma'am? Predators. So if we have predators, think about a food web, if we have predators that eat mammals and birds, and there's a plethora of small mammals out there for raptors to eat, then it provides them more opportunity to find food. If all of our small mammals disappear and it leaves quail behind, then those raptors, as well as raccoons and possums and stuff, are going to predate more on the quail and on their nests. And so by thinking about small mammals, if we increase our small mammal population, in turn, we actually increase our quail population. And then predators. A lot of people straight go to the bobcat. You know, we see the mounts with the bobcat launching, trying to jump up and grab the quail. Bobcats are a predator of quail, but it's actually not the number one predator of quail. It's more so one of the least predators of quail. Your raptors, as well as your raccoons and skunks, are going to be some of your most popular predators for quail. And again, a lot of that has to do with the actual nest themselves. And then I throw in hunting. They are a game bird, so they are hunted, right? And majority of the time, your hunters are going to be your best conservationists. Why? Because they want to be able to come back and be able to harvest that bird again next year. There's a study going on down in South Texas. I don't think they've published their data yet, but what they have found is that when comparing property all managed the same, parts are hunted, other parts are not, they have found that hunting has no effect on the overall population. With hunting, you still lose 80% of your population. Without hunting, you still lose 80% of your population every year. And so when you think about Aldo Leopold, his 5 tools of management were what? Axe, cow, plow, fire, and gun. And so sometimes we have to think about how do we manage our habitat. With that, we also think about the lack of fire. We don't use fire like we used to. Fire used to just run across prairies, and now we have towns everywhere, and fire's bad. We have to stay away from fire. Fire is a great secondary succession tool that benefit quail. If you have a very thick understory, can that bird travel on the ground through there? Absolutely not, and that's where that fire comes in, clears it out, especially if you get a quick, fast burn. So again, to know the bird is to know the bird. Canary of the prairie. If we start losing quail, we have other problems. The quail's the first to go. What's next? And so we have to listen to the quail, or the lack thereof quail, to know. Habitat is also important, right? We don't know exactly why the quail population is declining. They cannot pinpoint and say it's this. But what we have discovered is that a lot of it always comes back to the habitat, the loss of habitat. I mean, you think about if your home gets destroyed, you don't have a home to live in. It makes life a little bit more difficult. And then how do we fix this? We think about Texas is roughly 95% privately owned. So who's responsible for fixing this? The landowners. What we're also finding is that there's roughly, 3,000? Is it 3,000 a year? I may be off on that statistic. 3,000 new ranches, I use that term loosely, going into effect every year. We're not gaining land in Texas. What's happening is these larger pieces of property are being sold off into smaller pieces. So now we have that fragmentation going on. So if I buy 10 acres, I'm not going to be able to support very many quail. But if my 10 acres, along with my neighbor's 10 acres, and so on and so forth, and we all work together collectively, meaning we have to talk to our neighbors, we can then in turn help the quail. So there are a lot of great initiatives going on out there, TPWD, NRCS, several different types of quail coalitions and whatnot are working, but we have to also, as private landowners, play our part within the grand scheme of things as well. So, questions? Yes, ma'am.
Can quail coexist fine with the livestock, or do they?
They can. So, where I'm from, there's several ranchers who put as many cattle on their property as they can, and so they think more cattle equals more money, and so they just throw a bunch of cattle on there, graze it down till there's nothing left, and then sell all the cattle off. And so what we're finding is quail and cattle can coexist, but we have to rotate our pastures with our cattle. And a lot of times, what we're also have done in the past is we're just going to go out and plow the field and plant a ton of Bermuda, Bahia, that kind of stuff. That's more of a monoculture. We need as much diversity as possible. That's also non-native grasses. So if we can restore the land back to native grasses, allow a few brush or trees to pop up, then we'll start to see those quail come in if they're in adjoining properties. So yes, it can happen, but it's going back to the education piece. We can't do what we used to do. What we used to do didn't work if this is our ultimate goal. Yes, sir.
If you happen to be a landowner that had a couple of acres and wanted to reintroduce quail to your property, are there programs where you can do that?
Yeah, I mean, you can actually get a permit with the state to become a breeder in the sense, basically just protect yourself. But yes, there are breeders who will sell you quail eggs that you can incubate and then turn loose on your property. I would advise getting that permit just to cover yourself because you do have a game bird in your possession, and so you're going to want to raise them up in a brooder box before just turning them loose. Another statistic I didn't share with you is that when you pin raise birds like this and you turn them loose, only about 1% are going to make it to adulthood. Now remember, we said 80% dies off every year. So 1% is going to make it to adulthood to the point of which they're reproducing. So then you get your future generations, your F1s, your F2s, your F3s. So out here, we had hardly any quail. I mean, by that, we didn't even have a full covey. So we started this restoration project. We actually have two different sites, roughly 40 acres of native grassland. Both of them are slightly different. And so through our releasing of roughly about 200 birds each year through the first grader program that we do, we have now had several generations develop from that. We've had quail travel the entire property. I mean, you look across this field right here, this field gets hayed. But you look across this field, the quail are not going to like this habitat. But we've actually had quail come all the way up here to the building for some reason just to say hi. We've come across several coveys out in the field as well. We found them deep in the trees before. And so the birds have a way of adapting, right? But at the end of the day, we can't change the bird. The bird has to choose to change if they so desire. And so that's why the more we know the bird, the more we can help the bird.
Does quail have a specific temperature range? Like, is this an area where you find quail? Maybe not in New England.
So your northern bobwhites, yes, we find them from not full West Texas, but kind of slightly into West Texas, across Texas all the way to the south and up to the north, all the way through the east. And so basically your central southeast, ranging up somewhat into the north across the United States is where you're going to find your northern bobwhite. And so, I mean, they can handle, the cold temperatures up in North Texas, the hot temperatures out in West and South Texas. This species tends to like it a little bit more wetter than some of your other species that we mentioned, your Montezuma, your scaled, your gambles. Yes, sir.
You mentioned you're doing like quail restoration projects here. Are you also restoring the habitat, or are you doing any kind of prairie restoration to go along with that?
Yeah, so we have 2 units that we already have prepared. One of those units kind of fell to the wayside. The other unit is a slow progression. It didn't take as fast as we wanted to, and so that one's slowly developing. The one that we've kind of lost, I'm trying to restore through chemical application as well as fire. The problem with doing a fire out here is we're surrounded by a lot of people who don't understand, and so we have to wait for the right winds. We have a lot of programming going on, and so for the sake of our guests on site, we can only burn when they're not here. Plus, when it's like 80 degrees outside in February and plants start blooming, I can't get my burn in. I need to be burning right now, but it's too green on me already. So I'm gonna have to come in and probably shred it down and hope I can get a burn in next year. I could also do a very late summer burn, but I have to wait till after September because I may still have nests in the ground in September.
Are y'all introducing like native plants from other local prairies, or just bringing?
Yeah. We work with our master naturalist and biologist to come out and choose our sites and go from there. So I'm kind of on standby moving forward with any other pieces, but we've been working with the higher ups to try to include a third location. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you.